Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Retro Marky.
And my name's Dan.
Hello there, Dan.
Hello, how are you, chap?
I'm not too bad. Well, actually, I've been a bit sick, but I won't waffle on about it. This is a podcast about technology, computer games and video games, so I think we should get straight into it. However, we do have a slight apology, do we not?
We do. We did say that we were going to be talking about the coinops multi-system this week. However,
we're not.
We're not. And the reason being, interestingly, the coinops multi-system, there's a wealth of information behind this. It's quite an interesting story. We've decided we're probably going to break that up into a couple of podcasts worth of discussion.
It needs, the coinops is too big, too significant for us to rush it, and we want to do it really well, don't we? Okie dokie. So what are today's two main topics?
The first topic of conversation this week is Atari coinops. We want to discuss the experience of going into the arcade and some of the fantastic inventions that Atari came out with.
And kind of compare and contrast with the other coinops at the time. Because for me, I have this memory even to this day of how different the Atari coinops were contrasted to the other coinops, which are mostly Japanese, Namco, Sega, etc. And there's a definite flavour to the Atari ones that I think would be interesting to talk about.
There's some uniqueness there that we want to explore. I agree. The other subject we want to talk about today, horror games.
Yes, fantastic. I've been playing quite a lot of horror games recently, and I've played them on and off since we started playing games, I guess. And the same with you, no? They sort of come and go.
So we want to explore that, different formats, different platforms, and what we manage to get out of them horror-wise each and every time.
Yeah, and absolutely. There's an evolution, isn't there, in horror games that's probably a little bit more significant than in other genres of games.
Yes, because we think it's tied to the capabilities of the hardware.
Yeah.
In summary, but we'll explore that as we go through it. It's coinops really we want to kick off with, isn't it?
Yeah. The arcades. I mean, I could talk forever about the arcades. Just to put it in context for maybe any younger listeners, an arcade was a huge, pretty smoky, seedy, dirty...
Definitely seedy.
Yeah, seedy kind of place. Full of... I mean, one thing people forget, you can emulate an arcade game pretty much perfectly these days. But the thing about the coinops were you had the unique controllers, the unique environment and atmosphere of all these different machines with their bells and whistles and trying to attract your attention, trying to get you to put the money in.
They had an attract mode, didn't they? Each and every game would try and lure people in to spend their money and shove coins into a coin slot. Yeah,
so basically an arcade was so unique in that there was just music and sound everywhere, and people, and as you said, it was a little bit seedy at times, but absolutely brilliant fun. I wouldn't change it for the world. But to be more specific, we wanted to really sort of highlight that kind of mid to late 80s when we were playing a lot of Atari coinops, and also the other ones, and how they sort of varied and our memories and any anecdotes you might have.
Actually, getting into the arcade was a big deal, especially when you weren't 16. So you had to be 16 to get into the arcade. And there was
sorry to interrupt. Both of us we weren't mature 14-year-olds who looked like 16.
I didn't have a beard at that time, no. So to get in, there was a trick. When you were about 15 and a half, you got a national insurance number card. I don't know if you remember this. And so when you went to the arcade and they said, "You're not 16," you'd say, "I've got an NI card." And then they'd whip it off you and say, "Well, what's the number?" And you'd read back the NI number as if somehow that meant you knew something about the card. And you'd borrow somebody else's in the event that you didn't have one.
And of course we had Andy P, the famous Andy P we mentioned last time, who did look older than us.
Yeah.
And he would go to the... 'cause there was a booth, wasn't there, where you'd go to get your change. You needed 10
That's right,
piece. And we'd get him to go up there and we'd sort of sneak in around the side or something. Normally get away with it. I'll tell you another thing, actually, that is quite interesting. We used to have a thing called a tapper, which was a little electronic sort of mechanical device. It would go into the coin slot and give free credits.
Really?
We used to get thrown out a lot for that, yeah.
I never had one of those. What was it, you and Mr. P?
And a guy called Morris Moggy.
Ah, right.
I think he was actually the mastermind. He was quite an intelligent guy. And yeah, we got caught once or twice and kicked out. But also the coin-op companies, it wasn't just us. It was quite a famous thing to do, and the coin-op companies did find ways of improving their tech.
Yeah.
So that we couldn't, so it wasn't, in the old, I think in the 70s, you can get a coin on a piece of string and do it, so.
Yeah. Well, interesting, though, that the cost of a game, it started off at about 10p, but quickly rose over a number of years as the technology got more advanced and the experience became a bit more immersive. So 50p a game was a big hurdle.
It was. And it was always like, so for example, if the majority of games were 20p, the 50p one would be the amazing, awesome new coin-op that everyone was huddled around going, wow. Remember Hard Driving, for example? I mean, that thing was the size of a baby elephant. That was huge, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It had pneumatics and mechanics, and well, we'll get into that, I guess, in a second with Sega as well, with Space Harrier. Let's maybe go back to Atari. So, for me, Atari in that time were really magical and special. Now, I do know a little bit of background because I'm a big fan of the Atari 2600 as well. I'm also friends with Nolan Bushnell on Facebook. Ooh!
Showing off now.
And Clive Sinclair. So basically, Atari was split into the coin-op division and the home division. And of course, from our points of view, like I said in the previous podcast, we both said, the coin-op games were always the ultimate, weren't they?
Yeah.
The ultimate experience, yeah.
In the early days of Atari console gaming and other systems, it was a game, but it certainly wasn't the arcade experience, and it took some time actually for home systems to equal the capability of an arcade system. So when you took your money down the arcade, it was a premium experience that you were getting at that time.
It's a good way of putting it, actually.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the Atari games. What ones do you remember as being some of your favourites or most significant?
So there were some curiosities, some very weird ones, as you've mentioned before. A lot of them had some quite bespoke controls.
Yes.
So Marble Madness was an energetic game.
That was a weird game. The music, the whole feeling in that game was so surreal, wasn't it?
It was a bit trippy, shall we say. I'm not sure quite where the core of that idea originated from.
That was a trackball controller, wasn't it?
Yeah. So that was weird. So that, iRobot, which was quite a strange concept of a robot hopping around, colouring in a maze in 3D.
That was a weird one, yeah.
Under the all-seeing eye that was gazing down on it. Also,
Star Wars games, of course, they were quite big, weren't they?
Yeah.
All three of them. You had Star Wars, which is one of the best wireframe kind of vector games I've ever played, I think.
Star Wars was the game for a number of years, actually. It held a position within the arcade as being probably one of the best games to play. It was so immersive at the time to have that first person in the cockpit experience. It had absolutely monumental sound, and that was one of the things you get from an arcade.
And of course, a specific controller for that game, more or less. I mean, they used that trigger controller thing in a few games, but...
Oh, yeah, a very, again, bespoke controller that was, tied into the game. But in an arcade, the sound experience, you can't underestimate that. I mean, it was absolutely full on. All the cabinets were competing with each other. They'd be cranked up extraordinarily loud. And so to be sitting in this cockpit, because it was a sit-down game, playing Star Wars with the sound of TIE fighters screaming around you. And Wookiees, yes.
That was the TIE fighters.
Right, okay. It was just such a thrill as a young kid to see that.
I think the speakers were kind of, just behind your ears sort of thing, weren't they? If you can imagine that, behind you. Yeah, absolutely. And of course then there was Empire Strikes Back, which was the same technology. And then one of my favourites, Return of the Jedi, and they completely changed the whole format, didn't they?
Was no longer sort of vector graphics based. Nope. This was sprite-based gaming, sideways, what do you call it, isometric scrolling game, which was I found impossible, but you were a complete genius at.
I was pretty good, if I say so myself. Yeah, it was a beautiful game. I loved the samples in that game. And also we had, what other Atari games were there?
Well, actually, on the subject of samples,
that
was a big thing. That was a novelty. So on a home system, you wouldn't have the voice of the stars from in a game, say, talking at you. And I remember going back to Star Wars, the moment where you're flying down the trench, and Obi-Wan says, "Use the Force, let go."
Oh yeah.
And you let go of the controllers and crash the ship. Was a classic moment because somehow you thought you were being influenced by the voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi. And it was linking you into the game in a way that actually wasn't really happening. It was real immersion, wasn't it? And you couldn't get that at home. In fact, the first time I think I heard speech was probably some karate game on the 64-bit.
Yeah, maybe
not 64-bit, 16-bit.
A simple kind of some simple samples that were low bit rate. kind of a bit muddy. I mean, there was like Ghostbusters also on the Commodore 64.
That kind of thing.
Was it Mission Impossible?
Yeah, that's right. Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, they weren't samples as in, they were just like they were just tech demos, really, weren't they? It was just a bit of speech to show, ooh, we can do a bit of speech.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Whereas the coinops had the technology to put in multiple samples.
Where the Exploding Fist was the game on the Commodore that had some kind of sound sampling on it.
I didn't know that.
It was Where the Exploding Fist. There we go.
Yeah, also, I remember Paperboy, which had handlebars like on a bicycle. Another example of an Atari coin-op where there was no expense spared, was there?
I know. I mean, in the modern era, everything is done to a kind of a formula. And when they construct these things, they're using component parts that are sitting on a factory shelf already. But you can imagine with Atari and the games that they did, and I'm going to mention one in a second that was also quite bespoke, they put a lot of effort into designing a cab, and they must have cost a bomb.
Yeah.
And they were solid, but they would have these unique controllers. So, like you say, Paperboy had a set of handlebars, so you were riding the bike. How did you jump on it? Was it pulling the handlebars? Yeah. So you'd have to pull up on the handlebars to do a jump. The other game, and this is, for me, this is the classic Atari coin-op game, is Battlezone.
Ah, of course, yeah. Now we're going back as well, yeah.
And so we're going all the way back. One of my earliest memories is being in Giles Cafe in Melksham, and it had a few arcade games in it. Battlezone was one of them, and I was absolutely mesmerised. On the bigger versions, you would stand up, it would have like a viewing port for you to look in and play the game.
I remember that, yeah.
And also the controllers were the two sticks that you would move in order to rotate the tank one way or the other with the buttons on the... And so, again, a lot of work had gone into that, a lot of thought had gone into designing an experience around it. And it was also quite a wacky game, because not only have you got other tanks to fight, there was a volcano in the background, there were flying tanks, and a UFO. I mean, what a combination. But it was a brilliant game, wasn't it?
It was absolutely brilliant, yeah. And it's almost not quite VR, but the idea of looking through a portal, being immersed in a 3D environment, was a step in that direction. And this was like early 80s, I'm sure.
Well, I seem to remember the American military took a version of that on, didn't they?
Absolutely, yeah. And this has been the same with a lot of flight simulators as well, hasn't it? So what was the other game you're going to mention from Atari? It wasn't Gauntlet by any chance?
Well, Gauntlet definitely was a brilliant game.
Yeah, it was.
Which was multiplayer.
4-player. So it was 2D, I guess? Yeah, 2D, top-down 2D, wasn't it? But yeah, the multiplayer element was the huge selling point. And I remember that machine when it first appeared in the arcade that we used to go to, it was always pretty full up most of the time.
Yeah.
They must have made an absolute fortune on it.
Oh,
because instead of one person playing at a game at that time, you had 4.
So they're quadrupling the money that's being shoveled into the machine.
Yeah.
The only thing I remember about that is I played Valkyrie most of the time, and Valkyrie is about to die.
Oh, yeah.
Valkyrie is about to die.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the uniqueness, though. I do remember, I think, Gauntlet and Paperboy were the same technology. But yeah, I mean, you're right. That there's something about that era where money seemed to be no object at that time. If you could imagine it, they would make it. I mean, take hard driving. That was a huge, like I said, the size of a baby elephant. That thing must have weighed literally a ton. Then you had, and then Sega came along, of course, with games like Outrun and Space Harrier.
Yep.
And those, again, were huge, immersive cockpits.
Yep. Moving cockpits.
Yeah, with mechanical, hydraulic parts, yeah.
So as you turned the steering wheel or pulled on the joystick, you actually lurched left, right. And funnily enough, that will lead into a conversation about the Connex multi-system that hopefully we're going to start next week, because that had a home chair experience.
You know what, whenever I think of the Connex, I do think of Space Harrier from Sega.
Yeah.
That they saw that. Maybe they didn't, I'm speculating. But for me, in my mind, it's like the Connex people saw Space Harrier and went, ooh, I wonder if we could consoleize something like that, or make that available in the home with moving parts and specific controllers for specific games.
Yeah.
Which is something, I guess, now we're sort of creeping back into in the modern era. But I remember there was a period in maybe the 80s, 90s where, you know, you had your Super Nintendo, whatever. It was one controller for everything. If it was a racing game, if it was a beat 'em up. And the arcades, again, the difference was every game had its unique controller.
Yeah.
Steering wheels for driving games, joysticks for helicopter games, trackballs for marble. It goes on and on and
light
on.
guns for shooting games.
Light guns, absolutely. Oh yeah, the only other game I really have fond memories of was Indiana Jones, which was based on the movie loosely.
Yeah,
I think the importance of that was it's one of the few games I can think of, computer games, whatever you want to call it, that it's based on a movie and actually made a decent game out of it. I mean, GoldenEye is another one I can think of. I mean, this is a whole topic of conversation, I guess, for another time. But do you remember Indiana Jones? A weird 2.5D kind of perspective.
it was an interesting game. I seem to remember it was based on the Temple of Doom. Lots of mine carts and whipping people.
Yeah.
This was
And a weird perspective where you sort of went up and down ladders. It was kind of trying to be 2D and 3D at certain points. It was a weird, and you had some odd sound effects. Again, another surreal one from Atari. Mm-hmm. One of the few arcade games I can recall where it did have an ending as well.
Oh, right, okay.
I don't think many Atari games did.
Mm-hmm.
They basically get so hard that you just naturally have to die unless
Flunk
you
out, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because I was talking to you the other day saying that I don't have a lot of nostalgia for Sega for some reason. Yet when I started to talk about favourite games, I realised they were Sega.
Mm-hmm.
So what was it about Sega that was so different and so... Yeah, I can't find a nostalgia for them.
I think Sega had a period of about 5 or 10 years, and they were predominantly arcade-led. Where they produced high-quality systems, incredibly colourful and rich gameplay that was of a quality other systems were unable to match.
And I think it was the scaling sprites was the unique thing, wasn't it? They could make games like Outrun because they could move sprites 3D at such a incredible speed.
So that was Power Drift.
Yep, Power Drift.
And Space Harrier, of course. And that was a big one, Space Harrier, with the scrolling checkerboard floor and the scaling sprites. It was a great experience.
And just to explain in detail, the chair, so when you move left, the chair would actually shift to the left with the monitor on it, everything else. So moving around was an incredibly... I mean, your whole body moved with the game, didn't it?
If you wanted that kind of experience outside anywhere else, you would have to wait until not the arcade, the fairground came to town. When the fairground came to town, you'll get thrown about for a little bit of money. Now you could choose to do it by going down the arcade, putting money into a machine, strapping yourself in, but you'd sometimes have crowds of people watching you because it was such a unique experience and you'd feel the pressure to do quite well. So if you flunked it quite quickly...
You know what, that's another point that we haven't really mentioned before, which is that concept of playing a video game with an audience around you, because you don't get that at home.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, you do now if you live stream your content, so you can bring the viewers into your room, as it were. But at the time, that you would have a live audience around you watching a game, especially if they were queuing up to play it themselves, trying to see if you were the man.
Yeah, and it's a bit like, I mean, to put it into perspective, playing pool, for example. If I play pool against somebody in an empty bar or empty room, it's a lot different to playing pool when a lot of people are waiting to play and you've got to win to stay on. It's just that same thing with the coinops, isn't it? That it's one thing playing a game by yourself, but when you're surrounded by loads of people, the pressure's on, isn't it? The nerves kicks in, which can help as well. It depends on your talent and abilities and personality. But
exactly.
I must admit, I can't say that particularly I was ever surrounded by lots of people watching my skills. I was never a master at any particular coin-op, to be honest.
Well, I thought you did quite well at Outrun, beating that.
When I was drunk as well.
When you were drunk at the time, so plaudits considering the fact that I couldn't even get halfway through whilst I was sober.
The thing about that game was, it was a racing game. It's actually, well, basically, if you don't crash, it's not that hard. But if you crash, that's it, it's game over. That's how hard that game was.
Yeah.
You literally could not crash your car once. But if you didn't, you could get through it. But the time limit was pretty strict. It was a hard game at times. An absolute classic, though. If you had not seen Outrun or played it, check it out on YouTube, of course.
So we had a period. Atari, very innovative, interesting controllers and what have you. Brought an awful lot to the arcade. Then we had the likes of Sega come in, who I think were much better in the arcade than they were in the home arena. That's perhaps another conversation.
And even Nintendo as well, with games like Punch-Out, There might have been a few others. I don't remember many Nintendo,
But my feeling about the arcades, and this is where Atari kind of dwindled, was that the arcades kind of devolved into a series of beat-em-ups and beat-em-up clones that were like the Mortal Kombats of this world, where you had digitized characters fighting, or Virtual Fighter and things like that, and Street Fighter.
Of course, Street Fighter 2, yeah.
Yeah, and Street Fighter 2 in the arcades. And I felt the shine on innovation got canned, and I guess the developers of these suddenly realised having a cabinet with joystick and a couple of buttons was probably far easier and cheaper to manufacture than something with a set of handlebars. I mean, think about something like that when it goes wrong and the maintenance around it and the cost associated with it.
Oh, and think about the hydraulics in something like Space Harrier or Outrun. I mean,
it must have cost a bit.
They must have cost at least double, maybe triple, I'm guessing. But yeah, it was a huge difference, wasn't it? From a monitor with a couple of circuit boards in, kind of like what I mentioned with the Neo Geo approach to things.
Yeah.
And Nintendo to some extent with their Play 10 system. So one cabinet with a standard CRT, 17-inch, I think, and a few games that could be played on it.
Yeah.
2 specifically made coinops with hydraulics and special controllers.
They take up floor space, they take up power.
Oh, yes, I can imagine the power.
Probably high maintenance as well. So,
and one thing we wanted to sort of segue into is horror games from this, because we've come up with something, a couple of things, haven't we, where we realised that, I mean, back in the days of the arcade, you had a lot of platforms, you had shoot-em-ups, you had racing games, you name it, you pretty much had it, except for horror. Now, horror seems to be a genre of computer/video game that could never really have worked in an arcade environment, and it's something where the home systems shone and continue to shine.
You can never be frightened in a place that's packed full of people.
No.
Like an arcade with all the shining lights and everything that kind of pulls you out of that immersion that you need for a horror game. It's just never going to happen there.
That's true.
It is. So from home computing experience, there was an opportunity to be had within the horror genre to exploit that, yeah?
That's absolutely right. However, I think we need to break it down into 3 parts, because I've kind of thought about this quite a lot over the last couple of weeks, and I've been playing a lot of horror games as well. I think there was like 3 sort of phases, you might say, because what happened was, even with the coin-ops as well, actually, you did get games like the Aliens game, for example, which is a sideways scrolling shooter, and then at home on the 8-bit mostly, and sort of going into 16-bit era, there were games like Alien versus Predator and Aliens that were sort of in a Splatterhouse, also at the arcade. Now, they were sort of horror environments, but they weren't true horror, were they?
No, they didn't scare you, frankly. They were action of assault. My first horror experience on 8-bit that I remember was a Commodore 64, funnily enough, Aliens title.
Why do you think that was scary then?
So the game itself as a concept was to take a number of people from the Aliens movie through a base, series of rooms.
This is the Marines, isn't it? From
Marines
the movie.
and Ripley.
Yeah.
And you're taking them from room to room, and they may or may not encounter an alien or a facehugger. And so the 8-bit systems graphically were not rich, just a handful of colours on screen, and had a fantastic SID chip on the Commodore 64 where I played this game. So opportunity for sound, and they exploited that quite well in terms of when you encountered a room where there was an enemy in it, the alarm would be raised and it would go up, and the rate and the pulse of the alarm would go up, and it would work you up into a frenzy until you panicked. And when you had a number of characters in different rooms and all these alarms going off, it kind of freaked you out, frankly. Graphically, it didn't hook you in so much, but it was just a first taste, as it were, of potential horror on computing.
I do vaguely remember that game, and you're right. I mean, it didn't start off scary, but once you had, various alarms going off, and you were in charge of all the characters in real time, weren't you? So
That's
there's a lot of multitasking and jumping around. I guess you're right, and they used, presumably as best they could, the audio.
That's right, yeah. And I think Commodore 64 of any 8-bit system had the most opportunity to do well there. We worship the SID chip.
Absolutely,
on this podcast.
I mean, I haven't played it, but I'm imagining the same game on the Spectrum wouldn't cut it. All respect to the Spectrum. I love the Spectrum for many things, but
sound was not its strong point, was it?
Sound was not its strong point. And at that time as well, most of the other horror-ish games weren't really that scary. That was probably one of the first. I think the reason why was your imagination, because it was sort of a 3D perspective, but the aliens would be coming either from the left or right, outside of the TV almost. You're waiting for them to come in to your viewpoint. And it was that fear created by your imagination, I think, actually worked in that game.
Yeah.
Compared to most of the other games at that time that were, even the Aliens games were sideways scrollers, basically, platform games. So you could see everything, there was no lighting effects, it wasn't scary.
Funnily enough, I mean, that's the fundamental of horror. It's not the thing you can see, it's the thing you can't, and you're prompted by the sound cue, to say there's danger there, and actually what you'd have to do is swing from one side of the room to the other in order to see what was there or to escape.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think from that, so that was kind of phase one in a sense, and then phase two, I think really things like the PS1 iterate quite well with games like the first Resident Evil and Silent Hill as well.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first Resident Evil? Did you play it?
I did. I owned the first Resident Evil, and I would say actually this is where the hardware enabled us to do things we couldn't do before.
Starting to creep in now. The hardware's starting to get to that level where lighting, for example, could come into play.
Yeah. And the hardware would have a CD-ROM, so you could stream pre-rendered footage, cutscenes from the CD-ROM. And I think production levels actually, in terms of game development, had gone right up. So you'd have scores of music starting to come in that were, movie quality, starting to get movie quality at that time. And I remember Resident Evil was the first game that I found as a genuine horror. Yeah. Now, people will have all their own experiences. Obviously, we can only talk about our own subjective experiences.
Of course, yeah.
But for me, that was the first time where I felt that we were just starting to touch the horror nerve. And the technology was enabling us to do that. I think horror needs a certain amount of cinematic qualities in order to make it work, and better technology gave us better opportunities from that. And whereas we worship 8-bit in the past, horror didn't lend itself very well on that platform.
I don't think, to be honest, it really worked that well on 16-bit either. I think 16-bit was on that cusp of the 2D games were phenomenally good and looked fantastic. The 3D games were kind of still a little bit experimental. Yeah, games like Star Glider 2 and so forth, where the extra processing power could create games in that genre, but there wasn't much horror, I don't remember, on the 16-bit systems. No. And then you had, as I said, the PS1, and then that kind of leads into things like the Atari Jaguar as well, past the PS1, and the PS2, of course, where the Resident Evil games continue to get better and better. It's still going today, isn't it, Resident Evil? There's something interesting, though, just before you move on, that Resident Evil was a very successful franchise.
1996, the first game came out.
I was going to say that, actually.
I thought I beat you to it. 22 years ago, it was the year I met my wife, which was...
Wow.
Yeah, a long time ago now.
What I was going to say about it was, until recently, that was always a third-person horror game. And now they switched to first person. So obviously going into the first person gives the game a lot more immersion, which I think is a key factor in horror games, isn't it? Just to put that into perspective, I've been playing and watching some horror playthroughs in the last couple of weeks. And I've noticed when I'm playing a horror game, I mean, they can be incredibly frightening.
Yeah.
But if I watch the same game on a Let's Play, as a YouTube series, it's not frightening at all. And it's not because I know what's coming up. It could be parts of the game I haven't even seen yet. It's just that I'm not immersed.
Yeah.
Resident Evil went to first person, so it could therefore also go into virtual reality and be as immersive as possible. Is that kind of on the lines?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about suspension of disbelief. You play a horror game, because you want to be frightened, effectively, in the same way you watch a horror movie, you know it's a horror movie, and you want to be frightened by it. So I'm presuming that's why most people play a horror game, but I can't imagine people thinking, I'm going to get a horror game because I don't want it to be frightened because I find it challenging or something.
That is true to an extent. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I do play quite a few horror games. Not some of the scarier ones, but I play some that are fairly frightening, and I do sometimes question if I'm enjoying being frightened or not. In some ways I don't like being frightened. But what I do like are the environments of horror. So maybe, in my case, it's more that I like the darker side of life. things that are psychologically maybe challenging, different, confusing, cyberpunk-esque in some ways. So in the last couple of weeks, I think I mentioned to you when we were chatting that I've been playing Fear a lot, which is a first-person PC, I think it's mostly PC or only PC. Well, anyway, I'm playing it on PC. It's a 2007 first-person shooter. It's kind of a horror game, and then in many ways it's kind of not. It's a weird mix. But it is a classic PC game. I highly recommend to everybody to play if you're really into games with really good artificial intelligence in a first-person game. Now, the horror does creep me out a lot, and it has put me off playing the game. But even though I don't like the horror parts of it, I kind of still enjoy playing it. But there are times when the game frustrates me. I'm angry at the game, or I'm scared, and I do think to myself, why on earth am I going through this experience? I think, to answer what you were mentioning before, it's not just the fear factor. Maybe it's the fact that you want to overcome your fears. So it's not so much I like being scared. In my case, it's that I enjoy saying, you know what, this is frightening to me, but I'm going to find a way past it. I'm going to overcome my fears.
I think it's horses for courses. Different people probably do it for different reasons. And I know that certainly when I throw myself into a horror game, the thing I'm trying to get out of it is I want to suspend my disbelief. As I said, I want to put myself in a situation that I would never, ever expect myself to be in.
Hopefully not.
Yes, definitely not. And for that moment, whilst I'm playing the game, think, what would I do, and would I live or would I die? It's as simple as that.
That's a really good point. And I think that's why, I mean, this is sort of segueing into survival horrors, which is a kind of there's so many subgenres of horror games, but one I do like is survival horror. And that's because it tends to be, because it's focused on survival, it's less about jump scaring you and being, 1,000 ways we can make you feel scared. It's actually about surviving a pretty horrific situation that's horrific, maybe, but it's not jump scare horror. And those kind of games I love. One I'd like to mention is The Forest. Have you played The Forest?
I've not played The Forest. I have heard good things about it, though.
It's an excellent game. It's classed as a horror survival. There are horror elements to it. It might make me jump occasionally, but as someone who finds games like Silent Hill, for example, a little bit too much at times, or Amnesia is a classic modern horror game from the guys who made Penumbra. So the reason I'm saying this is I find it confusing because on the one hand, there are horror games that I can't play and absolutely hate. Yet there are other horror games I absolutely love. So I can't say I like or dislike horror games. I find it very confusing. So yeah, The Forest is more about survival in, again, horrific circumstances. But
survival horror, the pinnacle of survival horror for me, funnily enough, going back to yet another Alien game, Alien Isolation was a fantastic game out on the PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, other platforms, PC, etc. Now, this was a game that was brilliant, and the reason, to my mind, it was brilliant was that it puts you into that position of what would I do in this scenario. And the reason it works so well is that you don't have any superpowers.
No.
You have your wits, cunning, the ability to craft a few items in order to help you get through an immense labyrinth of a space station that is infested with androids, violent human thugs, and a single very intelligent alien. I
mean, that game is... I'm with you on this. It's very hard to summarise this game. It's beautifully looking. It really is. And unlike most horror games, although there are quite a few now going in this direction, it's not about running around shooting things and killing things.
It's about surviving.
In fact, in that game specifically, you get a gun, but it's best not to use it unless you really have to, because getting a gun and firing it means you're going to get the alien awoken to where you are. So I've been playing it recently, and if you sneak around and play that game very calmly, which I think is the key to it, it's a beautiful atmospheric game that is creepy, but it's not that horror in the traditional sense of throwing in lots of jump scares and the kind of tacky. Well, I say tacky, but tried and tested, I suppose, ways of scaring people. I notice when I'm playing it, it's more my imagination
Yeah.
Of, is it in there? Is it, if I go in...
Yet again, it's not the thing you can see, it's the thing you can't see.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other modern PC?
Well, I want to backtrack to Resident Evil 7, which I hinted was available in VR. So on PlayStation VR, I have this game. And I would say this takes horror to another level, because VR obviously takes you to a huge level of immersion, and the PlayStation VR system is very good.
I've heard, yes.
Frame rate, even, not frame weight. Frame rate, on a slow system, it's a frame weight. So frame rate's good, it's very smooth, graphically. I don't think it's the highest resolution system out there, but it works well for me. And I would say some interesting things about this game. So you start off, and I'm not going to give away any spoilers in this, but to say you start off and you get out of a car, which is a great experience in VR in its own right, but you get to a house. And whereas if I was watching this on a TV screen, I would have probably gotten through into the property in about 5 minutes and not given a damn about the way it looked. I found myself outside that property, studying it, looking at the detail, and there's some detail, things like, that fence is interesting. And look, all those spikes are pointing inwards, not outwards. They're trying to keep people in, not trying to keep people out. And the whole journey about working your way through into the house was so rich and immersive. So, what would have been 5 minutes was half an hour.
Wow.
And once you're in the game, without giving any spoilers away, there are a couple of moments that are not just jump scare, which are so brilliant in terms of the way that you're played, effectively. There's some misdirection that happens in one of the scenes that I had to do a double take, because I can't remember being led, but I must have been led to do one thing, which led to me missing something else happening that was very significant.
So it's got the intelligence of a magician.
Yeah, it feels very much like that, and you don't feel in control at all. So not only are you fully immersed, but the work they've done around the game, not just graphically, but in terms of the intelligence of that misdirection, is absolutely phenomenal. And I would say I'm probably about a tenth of the way through that game, and I'm too scared to carry on playing it. Frankly, it's been sitting on the shelf, and I know I've got to complete it one day when I've grown up and I'm a big brave dog, but not right now.
It's a funny one, this, isn't it? Because, Fear, I'm going back to Fear again very quickly, but that game, when I first got it many, many years ago, I did find it a bit too scary. However, I have gone back to it recently and I can play it now. And I'm really glad, because I love the mechanics of that game. Other games, like Doom 3, I went back to again a few years back, having started it many years ago and stopped. And both times I got to a point where I could not move forward. And you might think, oh my God, what a wimp. Oh no, can't be that bad. It's just a video game. When you're immersed in a game, even without virtual reality, as long as it's, I think, a first-person game, a game like Doom, it's horrible.
Well, funny, Doom itself is one we've not mentioned today.
Now, the classic, the original Doom. Sorry, I was talking about Doom 3.
Yeah, I know. So Doom on the PC was, I think, the first time I saw an FPS.
That was a scary game, but not...
No, it had an atmosphere, but not scary. However, Doom 3, you're convinced there's something unholy about this game,
I think it's actually evil. I really do. My theory is that most horror games are good people imagining bad things and making them happen, like in Resident Evil. Doom, there are bits where I'm like, okay, this is evil. The whole game is evil. I think you had the same thing about the Exorcist movie, but I know why, because I remember reading that a lot of members of the cast either died or had terminal illnesses during the filming. I find myself saying my least favourite genre of film is horror, yet my favourite films are technically in the horror genre, which is The Exorcist and The Shining.
Whereas mine is Herbie Goes Bananas.
But going back to horror and video games. So we've covered most of the main ones, I think.
The conclusion we could draw from the conversation is effectively technology is actually enabling horror in ways that we couldn't experience at all with 8-bit. So much as we have retro nostalgia to the max on this podcast, hands down, new systems deliver a much more frightening experience, don't they? Yes,
I agree. And I think, going back to my theory, we had 3 phases, and what surprised me, or I didn't expect, was VR as, I think, a 4th phase. Like you said, the immersion in something like Resident Evil 7 is just another layer of technological advancement that's creating an even more
I think they're
horror experience.
Definitely missing a trick with VR. They need to do a horror game with tentacles, because there are so many cables. It would be easy to juxtapose the two and think you're actually being really attacked.
Just for the record, I have played a horror game on VR on your Oculus. Do you remember?
I do, yeah.
And that was fairly low resolution, but it doesn't make a difference. That experience was amazing, and I remember there was a bit, you were laughing at me, where I just said, I don't want to go there. I'm not going in there. I don't want to move. I don't want to press W, whatever, to move forward anymore. I do not want to be here. I can't. It's horrible.
Yep.
It's really hard if you haven't experienced, especially VR horror, to explain how scary it is. But if you haven't tried it, because it's horrible. So I think we're pretty much wrapping up now. Is there anything else? I mean, what we're going to be talking about?
So, well, I guess our quick...
what are you playing right now?
Bi-weekly, what are you up to now piece? What are you up to now, Mark?
Well, I've mentioned I've been playing Fear, but I've also been playing... so I've been sick, so I've been playing quite a lot of stuff recently. And I've been playing Far Cry 3. I know it's a bit of an oldie, but I've got loads of games that I just don't get time to play sometimes, which is a little bit old by today's standards, but it's a first-person sort of shooter, but an open world RPG to an extent. Imagine Skyrim with guns, kind of, but it's not fantasy at all.
You take a bullet to the knee, not an arrow to the knee, right? Yep.
Also, I've been playing for a bit of fun at Just Cause 3. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you know this one. This is a third-person game, actually. It's a bit like Far Cry on steroids. It's just about creative ways of killing, blowing up, destroying just about everything. But the game's designed for that. It's like James Bond on steroids. An amazing fun experience. You know what? It's been a while since I just played a game for fun. Mm-hmm. I do that a lot on my older games, on the Commodore, for example. I play them for arcadey fun. But it's very on the PC. I don't play a serious game.
Okay.
And finally, I really want to recommend this one, Subnautica, which is a survival game. The difference being it's mostly underwater, so you've got all the perils of things like breathing oxygen, or not if you're unlucky,
or H2O if you're unlucky.
Yeah, exactly. So that's pretty much it. What about you, Dan? Anything besides Destiny?
Well, just a quick comment on Subnautica. I understand they sacked a sound engineer for making racist comments on Twitter recently. So
did they really?
Yeah, they're in the press for that. But myself, two things very quickly. One, I grabbed an old first-person shooter for the PlayStation 4 for a $5 from a game shop pre-owned thing called Evolve.
All right.
Which is great fun. Hunters versus a monster. It's a multiplayer game. The monster evolves. The hunters use their skills in order to try and trap the beast. Lots of fun for £5.
Is that a horror game or not so much?
Not really.
Not really.
No.
But a bit of an adult game by the sound of it.
FPS, very adult. Yeah, don't play it in front of the kids. There's lots of rude words in that. But from Retro World, I fired up my Amiga 500 and dug out Captain Blood, which was one of those weird games without, comparable format.
Yeah, I don't know where to put it. I can't even begin to talk about that game. It's just weird in every sense of the word.
People who owned it will look back and think, wow, yeah, I remember that was a great game. It was also very unique in the way that you had to pilot it was actually a computer programmer, I believe, had been sucked into a game, into a world.
I didn't realise that.
And then had, through an accident of hyperspace, cloned himself several hundred times, and you join the game towards the end when he's looking for the last 5 clones of himself, because each clone is draining part of his life force. And the joy of it's a weird game. You have to launch a flying fish down to a planet, navigate a canyon and find an alien on the planet, and then use an icon-based language in order to interrogate that alien life form.
Bizarre.
It is bizarre, but strangely addictive.
Yeah.
And you communicate with them in order to get coordinates of these clones or find other people. And you end up having to do things for aliens in order to achieve that.
I do remember had a Jean-Michel Jarre soundtrack or intro music or something like that.
I believe it was a remix of Ethnicolor from Zuluk. So it was great on the Commodore Amiga.
Yeah.
The Commodore 64 version was absolutely dire.
Well, this is another conversation for another time. As much as you and I loved the Commodore 64, there was a point where we realised, rather than the 16 bits releasing better versions of an 8-bit game.
Mm-hmm.
The 8-bits were trying to compete with the 16-bit games, and they couldn't. They were struggling.
Certainly on this game, it could not compete, frankly. So, yeah, that's what I've been up to game-wise recently, and I guess we're going to wrap up the podcast now with a promise that actually we are going to deliver something about Conex Multisystem in 2 weeks' time.
I would say it's going to be in the next podcast. If it's not, it's definitely going to be the one after.
Okay, right. Well, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from Retro Marky. Thanks for listening.